Well, hey, it's Craig. So you might be asking yourself, what's going on? And it's complicated. But maybe it's easiest just to break it down to the difference of what's right and what's wrong. Yeah, at some point, way back before recorded history, people had to work out some basic guidelines on how they were going to work with each other. Whether it was okay to steal somebody else's food, impregnate someone else's person, the basic stuff. How do we create a society? How do we create agreements amongst ourselves on how we're supposed to act? Because, different people have different ideas about what's right and what's wrong. And, you've seen it in your own life, I'm sure. And so at some point, it made sense to write it down or chisel it down or however they did it in the beginning that, well, here's certain things that are unacceptable. And, most rules are based on the premise of the golden rule. Like most religions, that's the one commonality amongst them is the golden rule. In other words, treat others as you would have them treat you. And that's a great way to go through life, right? Because, not everything goes your way, but if there's a certain level of fairness, you can accept the disappointments, knowing that, well, sometimes it's a mutual disappointment because that's what ends up being fair. And, as time went by, it became more and more complicated. There are little nuances to, well, what exactly is fair? And who really is in charge? Who makes the decision about what's fair and what's not? And for the longest time, it was not an elected person. It was the most powerful person. Somebody had to seize control and basically force people to abide by their rules because otherwise there were no rules. Somebody had to enforce it, and it was usually the strongest person one way or another. And over time, that turned into one of those sort of brutal dictatorships, where it was a king or, there was some arrangement where some hierarchy where, this guy had all the power and probably all the money or whatever was valuable, and he would choose how he would distribute it amongst the people who depended on his judgment. For better or for worse, and usually that ended up being a little worse. So it got to a point where by the time this continent was discovered by the Europeans, because obviously people were already living here, there were a lot of them that wanted to escape the systems that existed in Europe, most specifically. And they felt like they didn't have a shot under the old systems where people were sort of kept at a certain level in society where they couldn't really go beyond that level. They're always sort of called back down to that level because unless you're a part of the family of the leadership or with special favors given by the leadership, you're just another serf, just another peon, another person that just had to get by and hoping that the person in charge would take mercy on you and maybe provide you pretty decently. And people wanted to get away from that. And in most cases, it was really, it came down to religion. Once people started to find a little bit of freedom, religion's always been very important, one way or another, and people seem to, even more than most measures of discipline, they didn't like to be told how they were supposed to consider God. And there were certain rules in the old churches that just, were sort of changed on whim by the powerful. And, basically it boils down to consider the pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower 400 years ago. They wanted to get away from religious persecution. They wanted to try their luck in a wild land that didn't have protection from leaders, because they wanted that freedom to not only choose their destiny, but specifically to choose their God, the thing that they considered most right. So the Pilgrims, amongst many other settlers, took a lot of risk for that independence, for that freedom to choose their destiny. None of us can really choose how things turn out, but we can, this day and age at least, sort of choose the guidelines that we live under. Especially if you live here in the States, of course, we're supposed to have so much freedom that there's nothing that limits us other than basic laws that we agree to. And so if you're from a very, very poor family and you work very hard and you have extraordinary luck, you may become one of the richest people in the world, which has happened many times. You may reach amazing levels of power and leadership coming from absolutely nothing. And certainly you've heard the stories, and this happens. But this is one of the few places in the whole world where you still have a shot at doing that. Even in, the 20,000s, I guess it's the 2000s, right? 2020 was still a year where we could do what we wanted to do to some degree here in America. What's my point? Well, when we decided to create this nation, the United States of America, we created a document that spelled out the rules. We had on the government side their promise to us. We had the Constitution, we had the Bill of Rights. This is what you're allowed under this form of government to do. And there were also the laws, and that meant this is our agreement with the government that we will not violate these laws. So this is our contract between each other. So among many of the things that you could expect living in this country, whether you're born here or you became a citizen, is that you had equal say. None of the citizens, be it the President of the United States, the President of the largest technology company in the United States, or anybody, just some random guy that is a citizen of the United States, has exactly the same vote as everyone else. And that's the deal. And of course, the premise behind that was that if the people didn't like the way the government was running things, they could choose different leaders to change the course of the way the government was running. That's always been the promise. And certainly in my lifetime, I've seen changes. People vote different people in for whatever reason. And it's always fascinating because people tend to pick a very level field. There's always a mix of this side and that side. Maybe the House of Representatives is very liberal, but the Senate would be conservative, or the president would be conservative, and all of Congress is liberal. But almost always it's been sort of off balance, so they can challenge each other. And people have a instinct for fairness like that. And certainly the United States, in the almost 250 years that we've existed under this republic, more specifically a constitutional republic, that's worked out pretty well. You might be disappointed with who's in office, but you know that they can't get away with too much because the other side's going to keep them in check. So it's always been the premise, right or wrong, that everything was spelled out. The big stuff was spelled out. We knew what the laws were. We knew the basic rights that we had. We knew the way that things ran, we had expectations. We felt like we knew the country and the mechanism that makes it function. But I'd say my whole life, I've always heard from people how, well, you can't really trust politicians. They're kind of tricky. They'll do anything for the vote. And, government's so big that, you're gonna lose some of your rights one way or another because they're just gonna run over you. And all those pessimistic points of view. We've always heard it. And, it's easy to start feeling like a really small fish in a very big sea. With a huge population, it's a huge country, and the laws have become very complicated. It's, you have to have a special person to translate it for you, and actually a special person that'll allow you access to those rules. You have to go out there and hire a lawyer. You can do it yourself. You can defend yourself and represent yourself, but you got to know the special rules. And it seems that's become more and more and more the thing. It's, oh, well, yeah, it's what's right or wrong depends on who you hire, and we've seen it, right? We've all seen this, where some people get away with stuff that's like, well, there's no way I'd get away with that. And more what you see is that if people have power, some position of power, either in the state government, in the local government, in the federal government, they get away with stuff that none of us ever would. And we've seen it. We've all watched this over years and years. But, it's funny. Like I said, there's rules established. We know, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the laws, like I said. But, when you elevate somebody to a position of power, you've got extra high expectations that they conduct themselves as fairly as possible. But people being people, you got to have something additional. Yeah, the law is supposed to be on your side. They're supposed to follow the rules. I mean, heck, these are the people who make the rules, right? Especially when you talk about Congress. Those are the people who make the rules, make new laws, and choose to enforce certain laws. So when you put somebody, in a position like that, you want to do something to, kind of make sure they do the right thing. And so there's not much we can do. But one thing you always see before people take an office is they give an oath. They give the oath of office. They put their hand on the Bible, right up the right hand, and they read it off. It goes, I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I'll take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter. So help me God. So what does that mean, right? Well, you'll support and defend the Constitution. Those are the rules that we all abide by. And so, you're going to look out for those rules and make sure that they're, we hold on to them, right? We conduct ourselves according to those rules. Against all enemies, foreign and domestic. In other words, you can't have some other country coming in and start to dictate our rules and tell us how to live, right? And nobody inside the country should take over, take away from the people who are elected and put in those positions. You shouldn't allow that to happen. And that you accept that responsibility. I take this obligation freely. That means that I understand the obligation under which I'm operating. I understand freely and I accept the responsibility to defend the Constitution from enemies. And you will discharge the duties that you're obligated to do. In other words, you will do what you're supposed to do to make sure that you defend the Constitution. Because, again, you're a public official working for the people, and they expect you to abide by the same rules as they do. Fair enough, right? I mean, that makes sense. And the "so help me God" and putting your hand on the Bible is supposed to indicate that you're absolutely dead serious. That if you don't do that, not only will people hold you responsible, but God Almighty will hold you responsible. It is the most serious of pledges you can make, at least in the old days. But it shouldn't be any less of a pledge or an oath now. It's just as important now, right? It's always been extremely important that people do that. But let's talk reality. Have politicians been doing that? Have they been defending the Constitution? Consider this last year alone. I've been censored several times this year for either something I posted, that I borrowed from somebody else and I posted this link. No, that's not allowed. I was censored for things I said that they felt was unjust. I even was rejected to have a song boosted so that people could see it. And there's nothing objectionable about this. It just sort of like I'm under the microscope. Now, that violates my constitutional rights, the First Amendment, right? Freedom of speech. And lots of people have had this happen, and most recently, the President of the United States has been censored. Now, if you're one of the people who feels the President is repulsive and repugnant, and he should be censored, I suggest you check yourself, because there's been a lot of nasty stuff put out on the airwaves and posted, and pictures and ugliness, and we've all seen it for decades, and nobody seemed to have any problem with it. Certainly the opposite political party right now, the Democrats, the liberals, that was their thing, free speech. It didn't matter if it was the crucifix in a bottle of urine or what have you. We all had to support it because freedom of speech, freedom of expression. And we did, understanding that. But that was abused because not only was the nature of what was acceptable changed farther and farther and farther away from what used to be acceptable, but it also turned into this sort of counter-revolution of, and by the way, we've spoken up and we don't want you to argue with us. And so the people who benefited the most from free speech decided once they got into this position of power to take that free speech away from other people who felt differently than them. That's called hypocrisy. But it's also, it's against the law. But that's fine, right? All of a sudden that's commonplace because, a lot of people feel strongly this way or strongly this way. But only one group seems to have the ability to turn people off, So Twitter or Facebook, companies like that have suddenly made it their decision. Now, they're a private company. They can do what they want. But it's kind of getting ridiculous at this point, isn't it? I mean, we've seen this. We've experienced this in the last year especially. Let's not even talk about masks and things like that. All of a sudden, people are being forced to comply with rules that aren't constitutional, that we didn't vote on, that we didn't even have a discussion over. All of a sudden, there's just rules, and you're expected to follow these rules. And again, this is unconstitutional. And we see that with the Second Amendment. We see that with, this kind of gun is acceptable, this is not. You can't have this magazine. That wasn't about what's the right gun. It wasn't about any of that. It's about look, you have the right to bear arms. That's not, that, I don't want to get deep into that right now, but these are things that are spelled out. People are not defending the Constitution anymore. The people in power, the people we elected, are letting these things slide. Now let's take that just a couple steps further. In this last election, there were a lot of allegations by private citizens of fraud. People saw things happen. They took notes of it. A lot of these people were very experienced, worked elections for a very long time, and they were horrified at what they saw. And so when the election was over and we saw how the voting turned out, in specific areas, people had serious questions. They said, these are anomalies. This doesn't make sense. And people dug into things. Some were very good with numbers and had a background in numbers, and they were able to determine, these numbers don't come in a sequence that makes any sense. There's some impossibilities here. This doesn't work. If I were doing this from the standpoint of a bank, and most of these guys come from the financial sector, this would not pass the audit. This would fail the audit. And then other people were able to actually witness things happen, that these are irregularities that are not allowed. And then people ask the question, well, who allowed all these strange changes in voting laws? I said, well, those people over there. So, well, no, hold it. Those aren't the legislators. Those are district attorneys and judges and people, but not the people that the Constitution says makes the changes to election laws. The Constitution is very specific. It says the legislature is responsible for election laws. The legislatures were bypassed. So a bunch of states changed their laws illegally against what the Constitution says. And again, the Constitution, not amendments, nothing like that. It's in the Constitution. And then the Constitution also spells something else out. It says if we get into this situation where states can't agree on who they're electing, in other words, well, these guys said, well, I'm certifying this guy, this party. And the others say, well, no, I don't think that works because we see something wrong here. You can't certify it. But they have, and you say, well, you didn't do it right, and so we're gonna create another group of electors that reflect what we think is the truth. You then submit those towards Congress, and they're dueling electors. In other words, you've got both sets. It says, well, we don't agree with those. We agree with these, and we're just going to send both, which is kind of nuts, but that was anticipated that could happen. It's inside of a state. For some reason, somebody's doing something wrong. So the Constitution says, look, if this happens at that level, bring them both up here, and then when we start counting, we'll go back to it. We'll say, well, okay, you guys gotta figure this out. You gotta come back to us and tell us what your decision is, because you can't have both. And there's also a mechanism for that, and it's spelled out later in amendments that you could have 5 members of the House, 5 members of the Senate, and 5 members of the Supreme Court get together, look at all the evidence, and they'll decide. And inside of that, there's a lot of possibilities of how it could be worked out. And this has happened before, several times. Now, there was a lot of talk of courts. Well, when you see all this stuff, you should take it to court and they can settle this in court. But the courts looked at it from the Constitution point of view and said, we don't want to touch it. This is too big a deal, and there's already a mechanism, so we're passing on it. So, as you probably know, the courts never looked at any evidence of what people were calling fraud in this last election at all. They didn't look at a single bit of it. They just turned it away, saying, no, this doesn't come in right. They just didn't want to approach this because really they're not equipped to. It's the business of the legislators. It's the business of Congress. And so, again, it goes up to Congress. Now remember, all of these individuals that have taken some sort of public office have sworn that oath. And so, people are people, and sometimes they don't always live up to the oath. But when you get to the very highest level, it's really, really important because, again, that's the contract we have. And these are the guys at the highest level of government who are solely responsible. And the only reason they exist in those positions is to make sure the rules are followed. And if they aren't, to come up with some way to either change the rules or, and that usually goes to a vote, or to enforce the rules. Say, well, you know what, you guys have not been following the rules. We're the highest level, and we're going to force you to follow the rules, and you have to come up with a logical solution to this, or then we'll kick it to the Supreme Court, and they'll judge the rule. Well, that should have happened on the 6th. There were dueling electors from several states. They submitted, the very first one being Arizona. Then I think it was Ted Cruz suggested using that amendment where you take 5 legislators, or 10 legislators and 5 of the Supreme Court, and find the truth. Settle on the truth. Come up with a solution. Come up with a way to solve this problem. There's the beeper. So I have to sum this up with saying, they didn't solve the problem. They avoided their oath of office. They did not stick up for the Constitution. That's why people are so upset. What's going to happen next? Well, the Constitution gives the President of the United States a certain obligation, a higher obligation than the other offices. A higher obligation to follow the Constitution, the rules. Does he have the balls to do it? I don't know. Let's see what happens. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.